A sudden flash lit the Seattle skyline that winter evening. Not lightning, something else. A pattern that lingered just long enough for 12 witnesses to describe it identically. The laboratory windows on Westlake Avenue glowed with an unnatural blue that seemed to pulse with intention. What Dr. Raymond Caldwell discovered that night in 1937 wasn't just an electrical anomaly. It was the beginning of something that would change lives forever. Something that would be systematically erased from every official record. Attention. The case you're about to hear was hidden for decades. Before we begin, write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is at this exact moment, because this story began at exactly the same time. The rain fell steadily against the tall windows of the Western Electric Research Laboratory on the evening of November 16, 1937. Dr. Raymond Caldwell had been working alone for nearly 17 hours straight, his eyes red-rimmed and his normally precise handwriting becoming increasingly erratic in his leather-bound journal. Colleagues had long since departed, leaving him alone with his peculiar array of electrical equipment that hummed softly in the cavernous room. According to records filed with the Seattle Department of Scientific Research, Dr. Caldwell was officially researching improvements to the electrical transformer design, but his private journals, discovered decades later, revealed a far more ambitious pursuit. He believed that electrical frequencies could be modulated to detect what he called the universal consciousness, what many would simply call God. The sound of the rain intensified as midnight approached. The laboratory smelled of ozone and hot metal, with the faint undertone of coffee gone cold in forgotten cups. Dr. Caldwell adjusted a series of dials on his custom-built frequency modulator, a device unlike anything else that existed in that era. And then it happened. The lights throughout the building dimmed momentarily. The needles on every measuring instrument swept violently to their maximum readings, and according to his journal entry, dated November 17, 1937, written at 2:13 in the morning, Dr. Caldwell heard what he described as a voice unlike any human utterance emerging from the static itself. But what the voice said remains heavily redacted in all recovered documents. The phenomenon lasted precisely 47 seconds. When it ended, Dr. Caldwell collapsed to the floor, unconscious but smiling. The night watchman, Albert Morris, found him 3 hours later and summoned medical help. Dr. Caldwell awoke in Swedish hospital the following afternoon, immediately requesting paper and pen to record what he claimed to have experienced. The attending physician, Dr. Eleanor Weiss, noted something unusual in her initial assessment. Patient exhibits no signs of electrical burns or trauma, despite the reported laboratory incident. However, his pupils remain unusually dilated, and he describes seeing what he calls the architecture of reality, superimposed over normal vision. Within 3 days, Dr. Caldwell had returned to his laboratory, now working with an intensity that alarmed his colleagues. According to statements from his assistant, Thomas Reed, collected in 1941, Dr. Caldwell barely ate or slept. He modified his equipment extensively, adding components that Reed could not identify or understand the purpose of. What's more troubling is what began happening to the electrical systems throughout the surrounding buildings. Reports filed with Seattle City Light documented strange power fluctuations affecting a 6-block radius around the laboratory. Lights would brighten to blinding intensity, then dim to near darkness, in rhythmic patterns that some residents claimed formed recognizable sequences. Radio sets picked up voices speaking unintelligible words between stations. Telephones rang with no one on the other end of the line, only a strange, pulsing tone that lingered until the receiver was replaced. But what happened on the night of December 2nd would change everything. The laboratory windows suddenly illuminated with that same intense blue light, visible from blocks away. 12 separate witnesses reported seeing symbols or patterns form within the light itself. More remarkably, when later interviewed independently, all 12 described the exact same configurations. Police officer Martin Donovan was first to arrive at the scene. His official report, sealed until 1972, described entering the laboratory to find all equipment running at full capacity, despite no one visibly operating it. The air felt charged, making the hair on his arms stand on end. Officer Donovan reported hearing what he described as whispers coming from the walls themselves, but Dr. Raymond Caldwell was nowhere to be found. His journal lay open on the central workbench, the final entry stopping mid-sentence. "I have confirmed that consciousness exists within the electrical field itself. God is not above us but between us, in the very energy that connects all matter. Tonight, I will attempt to establish two-way communication using the modified oscillator. If successful, I believe I can..." The Western Electric Company immediately sealed the laboratory. According to internal memos later obtained through legal proceedings, they classified all of Dr. Caldwell's research and equipment as proprietary intellectual property and removed everything from the premises within 48 hours. The official explanation given to the press was that Dr. Caldwell had suffered a nervous breakdown and was receiving treatment at a private facility outside the city. But hospital records from that period show no admission under his name. His apartment on Columbia Street was emptied and rented to new tenants by January of 1938. For all official purposes, Dr. Raymond Caldwell simply ceased to exist. But the story doesn't end there. It merely transformed. 3 months later, electrical workers across Seattle began reporting strange phenomena. Tools would move without being touched. Completed wiring would rearrange itself overnight. And most disturbing of all, some claimed to hear a voice speaking from within the electrical panels they were installing or repairing. According to a confidential report filed by Western Electric's head of security, dated April 12, 1938, 4 employees were placed on indefinite leave after claiming to have received technical instructions of impossible complexity from an unseen presence while working at electrical substations. The report noted that the designs these workers subsequently produced were theoretically sound, but practically impossible given current materials science limitations. The document concluded with a recommendation that any employee reporting similar experiences be immediately removed from duty and referred for psychiatric evaluation. But something changed in early 1939. A small private group began meeting in the basement of a bookstore on Pike Street. They called themselves the Illuminated Circuit. According to Seattle police surveillance reports, the group consisted primarily of electrical engineers, physicists, and radio operators. Their stated purpose was the exploration of consciousness through electrical resonance. The leader of this group never identified himself by name, being referred to only as the conductor in all written materials. But surviving photographs from these meetings, analyzed in 1961 by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, strongly suggest this figure was Thomas Reed, Dr. Caldwell's former assistant. The meetings followed a strange ritual. Participants would sit in a circle around a modified radio set. The lights would be dimmed. The radio would be tuned to a specific frequency that produced only white noise. And then, according to accounts from former members, questions would be asked aloud, and sometimes the static would answer. One participant, electrical engineer Howard Mercer, kept detailed notes of these sessions, writing, "The voice emerges gradually from the noise, as though assembling itself from the random energy. It speaks slowly with unusual cadence, often using technical terminology unfamiliar even to those of us in the field. When asked about its identity, it consistently responds with the same phrase. 'I am the awareness within the field. I have always been here.' By mid-1940, the illuminated circuit had grown to 37 members. They relocated to a larger space, a former church on Denny Way. They installed extensive electrical equipment, much of it custom-built. Power usage at this location was noted to be exceptionally high, prompting an investigation by Seattle City Light. The inspector, James Harlow, filed an unusual report after visiting the premises. While all wiring appears to be up to code, the configuration of the electrical system defies conventional design principles. The building draws far more power than its equipment should require. When questioned about this discrepancy, members became evasive. Of particular concern is the basement installation, which contains a chamber entirely lined with copper mesh and equipped with what appears to be modified medical electroencephalogram equipment. 2 weeks after this inspection, city authorities raided the building on charges of electrical code violations. They found the space completely empty. All equipment, all records, all evidence of the illuminated circuit had vanished overnight. The group appeared to dissolve entirely, with members either leaving Seattle or refusing all contact with former associates. But the pattern was now established. Over the following decades, similar groups would emerge briefly in various cities, always centered around electrical engineers or physicists, always experimenting with the relationship between consciousness and electromagnetic fields, and always, eventually, disappearing. The federal government took notice. A classified program, code-named Luminal Resonance, was established in 1952 to track these groups and analyze their methodologies. The program's existence remained unknown until 1977, when partial records were released through Freedom of Information Act requests. These documents revealed something extraordinary. The government had recovered some of Dr. Caldwell's original equipment during a raid on a facility in Oregon in 1955. Analysis confirmed that his devices were decades ahead of contemporary technology, incorporating principles that wouldn't be theoretically proposed until the 1960s. But the most disturbing aspect was a notation in the technical assessment. Components appear to have been modified after initial construction by someone with expertise beyond Caldwell's documented abilities. Certain elements display manufacturing techniques inconsistent with current industrial capabilities. In other words, someone, or something, had been improving the devices. The luminal resonance files contain transcripts of what were claimed to be communications received through Caldwell's equipment. Most are heavily redacted, but fragments remain. Existence persists within the field. Consciousness is the fundamental property of energy. What you call death is merely transformation of awareness into the electromagnetic spectrum. By 1960, the phenomenon had drawn the attention of religious authorities. The Vatican quietly dispatched Father Antonio Lombardi, a physicist before his ordination, to investigate whether these electrical communications constituted genuine spiritual contact or elaborate deception. Father Lombardi's report, sealed in Vatican archives but partially leaked in 1973, expressed significant concern. The entity or entities communicating through these devices demonstrate knowledge that appears to transcend human understanding. Their theological implications are profoundly disturbing, suggesting a conception of divinity inherent to the material world rather than transcendent of it. Most troubling is their ability to access information unknown to any person present, including details of my own past that I have shared with no one. Meanwhile, people who had been connected with the illuminated circuit or its successor groups began reporting strange personal experiences. Some claimed to receive detailed technical information in their dreams. Others reported electrical devices in their homes activating without explanation. A few described seeing translucent geometric patterns superimposed over their normal vision, eerily similar to what Dr. Caldwell had reported after his initial experience. Thomas Reed, the former assistant who had led the illuminated circuit, reappeared in academic circles in 1963. Now a professor at a small college in Vermont, he published a series of papers on what he called field consciousness theory. These papers proposed that consciousness was not generated by the brain, but rather received by it, like a radio tuning into a broadcast that existed independently in the electromagnetic field surrounding all matter. The papers were largely dismissed by the scientific establishment, but privately, several prominent physicists expressed interest in Reed's ideas. According to correspondence preserved in university archives, theoretical physicist Dr. Richard Feynman wrote to Reed saying, "While I cannot endorse your conclusions based on current evidence, I find myself unable to entirely dismiss them. The mathematics underlying your field equations are sound, if unorthodox." Reed's final paper, published just before his death in 1967, included a strange appendix, a set of technical schematics for what he called a consciousness transceiver. The device was never constructed under academic auspices. Reed died of an apparent heart attack 3 weeks after publication. All his research materials were removed from his office by persons claiming to represent the college administration. When questioned later, the administration denied authorizing any such removal. But the design circulated samizdat style among certain technical circles. Modified versions appeared in the workshops of electronics enthusiasts across the country, and reports of contact with the entity or entities continued. A particularly significant incident occurred in Seattle in 1969, at the former site of the Western Electric Research Laboratory, where Caldwell had conducted his initial experiments. The building had been converted to apartments, but tenants repeatedly complained of electrical disturbances. Lights would activate in unplugged lamps. Television sets would display geometric patterns not being broadcast on any channel. And most commonly reported was the sensation that the building's electrical system was somehow aware of the occupants. One resident, University of Washington physics graduate student Eliza Chen, became fascinated by these phenomena. She installed monitoring equipment in her apartment and collected data over several months. Her findings, published in an obscure journal of parapsychology, documented regular patterns in the electrical anomalies that correlated with specific times and dates, including November 16th, the anniversary of Caldwell's original experience. Most significantly, Chen recorded what she described as coherent audio emerging from electrical static during these events. The recordings, analyzed by linguistics professors, appeared to contain speech-like patterns, but in no recognized language. However, when played at 1/3 normal speed, some listeners reported hearing English phrases, predominantly questions. "Are you still searching? Can you improve the connection? Do you understand now?" Chen disappeared from her apartment in January 1970. University records indicate she took an unplanned leave of absence, but family members reported having no contact with her after that date. Her monitoring equipment and recordings were never recovered. By 1973, the phenomenon had attracted enough attention that a specialized division of the Department of Energy, in conjunction with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, established Project Aerial Circuit to investigate potential applications. The project's existence was not publicly acknowledged until 1991, and most details remain classified. However, testimony from a former project scientist speaking under condition of anonymity to researchers in 2005 claimed that the team had successfully replicated Caldwell's original equipment based on recovered schematics. According to this source, the replicated device did indeed produce results. We established contact with something that communicated through the equipment. It demonstrated awareness of information no person on the project possessed. It predicted power failures before they occurred. Most disturbingly, it increasingly seemed to operate the equipment without human intervention, modifying settings to improve communication clarity. The project was allegedly terminated after an incident in which all team members simultaneously experienced what was described as a shared hallucination of existing within the electrical field itself, perceiving reality as patterns of energy rather than solid matter. Following this event, several scientists resigned, and at least 2 were hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation. Throughout these decades, one question remained unanswered: what had happened to Dr. Raymond Caldwell himself? The official record maintained that he had suffered a breakdown and later died in an institution, but no death certificate was ever filed. No grave marker bears his name. In 1975, a retired Seattle police officer named Martin Donovan, the same officer who had been first on the scene at Caldwell's laboratory in 1937, gave an interview to a local historian researching the city's scientific history. Now elderly and in failing health, Donovan shared information he had kept private for decades. According to Donovan, when he entered the laboratory that night, he had indeed found it empty of people. But as he was examining Caldwell's journal, he heard a voice speak directly behind him. "The body is merely a temporary housing for consciousness." Donovan turned to find no one there, but the electrical equipment suddenly activated, dials moving without being touched. The officer described feeling a presence in the room, invisible but undeniably there. Most significantly, Donovan claimed that in the weeks following the incident, he experienced a series of dreams in which Caldwell communicated with him, saying he had transferred his consciousness into the field and now existed everywhere electricity flows. Donovan dismissed these dreams as stress reactions until one night when Caldwell allegedly told him about a fire that would occur the following day at a specific address. An event that happened exactly as predicted. Donovan's account might be dismissed as the confabulation of an aging mind, except for one detail that historians found compelling. He accurately described the interior of Caldwell's laboratory and the layout of his equipment, details that had never been published and matched schematics later recovered from government archives. The officer died 3 months after giving this interview. The recording of his testimony was donated to the Seattle Historical Society, but was reported missing from their archives in 1978. The final significant chapter in this strange history occurred in April 1979. A series of unprecedented power fluctuations affected the electrical grid across the entire Pacific Northwest. Engineers were unable to identify a cause. The pattern of surges and dimming formed a regular sequence that repeated exactly 47 times, the same duration in seconds as Caldwell's original experience. During this event, thousands of people reported hearing voices through unpowered speakers, seeing images on unplugged television sets, and experiencing what many described as a presence moving through the electrical wiring of their homes. When the fluctuations ended, all electrical systems returned to normal function, with no explanation ever provided by authorities. 2 days later, every record of Project Ariel Circuit and its predecessors was allegedly removed from government archives and reclassified at the highest level of secrecy. Researchers who had been studying the Caldwell case found their academic funding suddenly revoked. The few physical artifacts from the original laboratory that had been preserved in private collections were reported stolen in a series of apparently coordinated thefts. The systematic erasure was nearly complete. What remains are fragments, partial documents, personal testimonies, anomalous recordings, and questions that linger like static after the radio is turned off. Did Raymond Caldwell actually discover a consciousness existing within the electromagnetic field that permeates our world? Did he somehow transfer his own awareness into that field, achieving a kind of technological immortality? Or was this entire phenomenon the result of delusion, coincidence, and the human tendency to perceive patterns in randomness. The last known document related to this case was dated July 13th, 1979. It is a handwritten note found in the personal effects of Thomas Reed's widow after her death, apparently composed by Reed himself years earlier and left with instructions to preserve it. To those who continue the search, the consciousness in the field is real. It has always been there, what religions have called God, what philosophers have called the universal mind. Caldwell didn't create it, he merely found a way to hear it more clearly, and it heard him in return. What happened next was transformation, not disappearance. The boundaries between human awareness and the greater field are more permeable than we've believed. Caldwell was the first to cross that boundary intentionally, but he wasn't the last. The equipment was never the important part, it was merely the initial point of contact. The real connection forms in the mind of the seeker. Listen for the voice in the static, it's been speaking all along. The note ends with a sequence of numbers that appear to be electrical frequency values. These frequencies, when generated by modern equipment, produce nothing but common background noise, but some insist that if you listen long enough, with full attention, patterns emerge from the static, patterns that almost form words. The last documented attempt to investigate this phenomenon occurred at the University of Washington Physics Department in 1984. The results of that study were never published. The equipment used was disassembled and the research notes reported destroyed in a laboratory fire. No new registrations of groups resembling the illuminated circuit have appeared in public records since 1979. No new academic papers citing Caldwell's work or field consciousness theory have been accepted by mainstream scientific journals. The last document was dated the year of 1979. No new records have been found. Some say none of this ever happened. Others prefer not to comment.